Have you ever felt like you spend hours consuming videos, articles, and posts, but at the end of the day, you feel like you haven't really learned anything? Well, you're not alone. The promise of the digital age was simple. Unlimited information would mean more knowledge, more intelligence, more opportunities. But what really happened? We became trapped in a vicious cycle, consuming more and more without retaining almost anything. This was no accident. The big platforms have designed this system to addict you, exploiting the deepest mechanisms of your brain. You believe you're in control, but in reality, you're being manipulated without realizing it. In this video, I'll show you how we've been duped by content addiction, the silent impacts this has on your life, and, most importantly, how you can regain control of your attention and your learning. If you've ever spent hours watching videos without being able to stop, or feel anxious because you're always behind on everything that's happening in the world, stay until the end. What you'll discover here could change the way you consume content forever. Imagine walking into a restaurant where there is a buffet with endless food options. You can try a different dish every minute without ever repeating the same taste. Sounds incredible, right? But now, imagine that no matter how much you eat, you never really feel satisfied. There's always something new to try, and with every bite, your hunger seems to increase rather than decrease. This is exactly what happens with the consumption of digital content. Never before in history have we had access to so much information. At any one time, we can watch a documentary, read a scientific article, listen to a podcast, or explore a book in seconds. But, paradoxically, this excess doesn't make us any wiser. On the contrary, we are more distracted and confused than ever. The problem is not just the amount of information, but the way we consume it. We jump from one video to another, from one post to the next, without really absorbing anything. What once required effort and reflection is now served up quickly, superficially, and addictively. The simple act of learning has been transformed into an endless entertainment marathon. Our brains are programmed to seek quick and easy rewards. For centuries, learning something new required effort. You had to read, interpret, discuss, and apply the knowledge. Now, everything is just a click away. In a matter of minutes, we can watch a summary of a 500-page book or consume a flood of information on a complex subject without having to think deeply about it. The problem is that watching is not the same as learning. What happens inside our brains when we just passively consume content is very different from what happens when we actually study and apply an idea. Real learning requires repetition, practice, and, above all, time to process what has been absorbed. But the internet has conditioned us to a constant stream of news, where each new video or article gives us the false sense of progress. You feel like you're learning, but in reality, you're just consuming passing stimuli. This is the great illusion of digital content. It feels like we're moving forward, but in practice, we just become dependent on the next dose of information. Another side effect of this vicious cycle is information anxiety. Before, in order to learn something, you had to choose carefully what to study. Now, we are bombarded with hundreds of options every second. There's always a new video that you need to watch, a new essential article, or a new podcast that will change your life. The result? A constant feeling of being behind. You feel that you never know enough, that there is always something more to consume before you make any decision or take any action. This generates a state of intellectual paralysis. The more information you have, the harder it becomes to filter out what really matters. And this anxiety doesn't happen by chance. Platforms have been designed to exploit this sense of urgency, keeping you always connected, always consuming, always afraid of missing something important. There is another important factor that explains why we are trapped in this cycle: addiction to novelty. Our brains were programmed to constantly seek out new information. an evolutionary instinct that helped us survive in the wild. In the past, being on the lookout for new discoveries could mean finding food, avoiding a predator, or discovering a valuable opportunity. But in the digital world, this incessant search for novelty has become a problem. Now, we're constantly jumping from one piece of content to another, training our brains never to stay focused for long. This behavior leads to a chronic attention deficit, making it increasingly difficult to concentrate on important tasks and delve into a single subject. This explains why so many people start books and never finish, why long videos seem tiresome, and why we spend more time browsing aimlessly than actually absorbing something useful. We are constantly being rewarded with small doses of dopamine, but these rewards are empty. They don't lead to real learning or growth. If before the difficulty was finding quality information, today the problem is the opposite. We are buried in an excess of irrelevant data, and this comes at a high price. We lose our attention span, become dependent on external stimuli, and stop developing critical thinking. The impact of this is not just intellectual, it's emotional. The feeling of always being behind, of never knowing enough, generates stress, frustration, and even depression. We become passive consumers of information, but not active creators of knowledge. The worst thing is that the further we fall into this cycle, the harder it becomes to escape it. Each new video, each new notification, each new article reinforces the behavior, making the addiction deeper and deeper. Now that we understand how this cycle works, we need to explore the hidden structure behind it, the systems that have been created to keep us trapped in this endless spiral. Because yes, this is no accident. It's a carefully planned project to hold your attention hostage. If you've ever opened a social media app with the intention of spending just a few minutes and before you knew it, you'd lost a whole hour, know that it didn't happen by chance. Your time and attention are the most valuable resources of the digital age, and the big tech platforms know exactly how to hold them. What looks like a simple news feed or a playlist of recommended videos is actually a system meticulously designed to capture your mind and prevent you from leaving. The algorithms behind these platforms are not neutral. Not only do they show you content based on what you like, but they also learn how to keep you engaged for as long as possible. To do this, they exploit psychological mechanisms deeply rooted in the human brain. The first of these is the so-called slot machine effect. Think of a slot machine. Every time you pull the lever, you don't know exactly what you're going to get. It could be a big prize, a small one, or nothing at all. This unpredictability is addictive because it activates the brain's reward system. Now compare that to the way we scroll through our Instagram feed, TikTok, or YouTube Shorts. With every swipe, new content appears and we never know exactly what's coming next. Every now and then, we find something extremely interesting, which reinforces the behavior and keeps us scrolling, hoping for another prize. There's also the factor of dopamine, a neurotransmitter that regulates motivation and pleasure. Each like, comment, or interesting new video releases small doses of dopamine, creating a reward cycle that keeps us hooked. The platforms understand this and distribute these small prizes strategically. The aim is not just to please, but to ensure that you stay as long as possible. That's why you can watch a video on YouTube, and when you've finished, the platform already suggests another one that looks even more interesting. The recommendation is not random. It has been calculated to ensure that you don't feel like leaving. What makes this system even more dangerous is that it adapts to your behavior. The more you consume, the more the algorithm understands your patterns and optimizes the suggestions to keep you hooked. It learns your preferences, your emotions, and even the times of day when you are most likely to be distracted. If you've noticed that on days when you feel more tired or anxious, it's even harder to get off social media, that's no coincidence either. The platforms know exactly when to offer you highly addictive content. Another essential element of this mechanism is the fear of missing out, or FOMO, fear of missing out. Social networks and news platforms exploit this feeling to keep you constantly connected. You feel that you need to be constantly updated, that something important could be happening at any moment, but this updating never ends. There's always one more video to watch, one more news story to read, one more debate happening in real time. The result is a state of constant hyperconnectivity, which drains your attention and consumes your mental energy. And the most impressive thing is that all this happens without us realizing it. Unlike a traditional addiction, such as to cigarettes or alcohol, where there are clear physical signs of dependence, addiction to digital content is silent. It disguises itself as productivity, learning, and socializing. You feel you're just keeping yourself informed or entertained, when in fact you're being manipulated by systems that have been designed to exploit your cognitive vulnerabilities. The consequence of this is a fragmented mind, unable to concentrate for long periods or absorb knowledge deeply. When we are exposed to fast and constant stimuli, we lose our capacity for reflection. We start to consume information superficially without time to question, process, or really learn. We become passive spectators of an endless stream of content that dictates what we think, what we feel, and even how we behave. If you feel that your ability to focus has diminished in recent years, that you're always jumping from one piece of content to another without being able to finish anything, that you feel anxious when you're away from the screen, know that this isn't an individual problem. You are not lacking discipline or lacking willpower. You are fighting against a structure designed to exploit your attention as a financial resource. Now that we understand how the algorithm keeps us trapped, an even more disturbing question arises. Is all this unbridled consumption of information really making us smarter? Or are we just creating the illusion of learning? While in practice, we are only becoming more dependent on this cycle. What does learning really mean? For centuries, humanity has understood that knowledge is not just about information, but about retention, reflection, and application. However, in the digital age, we have been led to believe that consuming more content equates to learning more. We spend hours watching educational videos, reading articles, and listening to podcasts. But when we need to use this knowledge, we realize that little has remained. If information were synonymous with wisdom, we'd all be geniuses. But what actually happens is the opposite. We've never had so much access to knowledge, and paradoxically, we've never been so distracted, so superficial in our learning. This is because the simple act of passive consumption does not generate real knowledge. Our brains need three fundamental elements to learn: repetition, reflection, and application. But the way we consume digital content attacks exactly these three pillars. First, repetition is replaced by the incessant search for novelty. Instead of revisiting an idea to reinforce it in our memory, we are encouraged to look for the next video, the next article, the next piece of information. Secondly, reflection disappears because we never take the time to process what we consume. As soon as we've watched one impactful video, we're already watching another without pausing to digest what has been said. Finally, application takes a back seat because we get used to the feeling of illusory progress. We feel we've already understood the concept, so we don't bother to test it out in practice. The human brain works selectively. It quickly discards information that it doesn't consider relevant to survival or concrete goals. If you read an article about productivity but don't apply any techniques in your daily life, your brain understands that it wasn't important and simply deletes the information. This means that most of the things we consume online are lost within a few days, or even a few hours. You may have watched an incredible video on philosophy or psychology yesterday, but if you haven't reflected on it, debated the idea with someone, or found a way to apply it to your life, there's a good chance that next week you won't even remember what you've learned. This phenomenon has been studied by neuroscience for decades. The so-called forgetting curve, a concept developed by psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus, shows that without review or application, we forget around 80% of what we learn within a few days. This means that by consuming content passively, we are only piling up temporary information without actually consolidating it. What remains in the memory is not what we watch, but what we practice and experience. The most dangerous thing about all this is that the illusion of learning generates a perverse psychological effect. The excess of information makes us feel that we are evolving, when in reality, we are just drowning in unstructured data. We create the feeling that we know a lot, when in fact we only store fragments of knowledge that we can't organize or use in practice. The result is a modern paradox. The more content we consume, the less confident we feel about what we really know. This insecurity leads us to seek out even more information, creating an endless cycle of consumption without retention. In addition, the format of digital content contributes to this superficiality. Social networks, short videos, and quick articles are designed to deliver instant impact, but rarely delve deeper into a topic. Platforms favor quick, easy-to-digest content because it generates the most engagement. The problem is that real learning requires effort, reflection, and time. But we've been conditioned to avoid anything that seems difficult or time-consuming, and so we spend less and less time reading entire books, studying in depth, or devoting attention to a single topic over a long period. The excess of information also generates a little discussed side effect: intellectual paralysis. When we have access to many different ideas at the same time, we begin to doubt which path to follow. For example, imagine someone who wants to improve their productivity. If they search for tips online, they'll find hundreds of different methods, organization techniques, focus hacks, high-performance habits. But instead of applying a method and trying it out, they may fall into the trap of consuming so many options that they can't decide where to start. They feel they need to study more before they act, and so learning never leaves the realm of theory. This happens in any area of knowledge. The more information we have, the more difficult it becomes to choose a path and take action. This illusion of learning means that many people spend years studying without ever putting anything into practice. They feel busy, productive, and intellectually active, but when they look back on their lives, they realize that little has changed. That's because consuming information doesn't transform anyone. What transforms is action. The great truth is that knowing doesn't change anything if you don't do something with that knowledge. Now think about your own behavior. How many times have you consumed something that seemed extremely useful only to realize a few days later that you hadn't applied it at all? This doesn't mean that you lack discipline or the will to learn. It means that you've been led to believe that consuming is enough, but it's not. And as long as we continue in this cycle of superficial learning, we will only be accumulating data without any real growth. The greatest danger of content addiction is not just the time it consumes, but what it does to our minds without us realizing it. If it were just a matter of spending a few extra hours watching videos or reading articles, it wouldn't be such a serious problem. But what's happening goes far beyond that. We are slowly losing our ability to focus, to reflect, and even to connect with the real world. And this comes at a huge cost. Human attention is a limited resource. When we get used to constant stimuli, our ability to concentrate becomes fragmented. Have you ever tried to read a book and realized that after a few pages, your mind was already elsewhere? Or started an important task and, without realizing it, picked up your phone to check something unimportant? This is not a lack of discipline. It's a direct symptom of too much digital stimulation. When we consume content passively and uninterruptedly, we are training our brains to always look for the next stimulus, making it increasingly difficult to stay focused on a single thing for a prolonged period. This has a direct impact on memory. The brain needs time to consolidate information, but when we're jumping from one video to another, from one post to the next, we don't give this process space to happen. We live in a constant state of mental overload where everything seems important, but nothing really sticks. The excess of information creates the false impression that we are absorbing something, but in reality, we are just training our minds to forget quickly. The effect of this is not only intellectual, but also emotional. Have you ever felt that even after a whole day of consuming content, there is still something you should have read or watched? This feeling that we are always behind, that we never know enough, generates constant anxiety. The illusion of learning we discussed earlier not only robs us of focus, but also keeps us in a state of permanent dissatisfaction. We're always chasing more knowledge, more information, more updates, and this generates deep mental fatigue. It also has a direct impact on creativity. The creative mind needs space, moments of boredom, time to connect ideas spontaneously. But when we're always consuming content, we never allow these connections to happen. We become just receivers of information, but not producers of thought. If you've ever felt that you struggle to create something new, to come up with original ideas, or even to make important decisions without having to research first, this could be a direct reflection of this unbridled consumption. The more time we spend watching, the less time we spend thinking. The invisible cost of content addiction is not just in wasted time, but in the silent transformation of our own behavior. We become more reactive and less reflective. We begin to rely on screens to fill every free moment, unable to simply be in the present without an external stimulus. This affects how we work, how we learn, and even how we relate to each other. How many times have you noticed that in a moment of conversation with someone, your mind was elsewhere, pulled back to what you saw in a video, a post, or a news story? Partial attention has become the new normal, and it weakens our human connections in a subtle but devastating way. Perhaps the most worrying thing is that the deeper we get into this cycle, the harder it becomes to break out of it. The brain adapts to the habits we repeat every day. If we get our mind used to consuming content nonstop, that's exactly what it will keep looking for. And so, more and more, we become spectators of our own lives, while the real world happens around us. If this content is making sense to you, now I want to ask you something important. Like the video, because it helps me reach more people who also need to understand how this addiction is affecting their lives. And now I want to know, have you ever felt that you're consuming too much content but learning too little? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear about your experience. We live in the most connected time in history. We can talk to anyone, anywhere in the world, at any time. We can follow the lives of friends, family, and even strangers in real time. See their photos, read their thoughts, take part in debates. It's never been easier to interact, and yet we've never been lonelier. This contradiction isn't just a side effect of technology. It's the very operating model of the networks we use every day. What was once a means of bringing us closer to those far away has become a substitute for real connections. Deep conversations have been replaced by likes, reactions, and emojis. Instead of asking how someone is, we simply see a post and assume we know. Human contact has been replaced by quick, fragmented, and often superficial interactions. And deep down, we feel that something is missing. This is because digital interactions, however constant, do not satisfy the human need for true connection. Exchanging messages can maintain contact, but it doesn't replace physical presence. Comments may seem like social interaction, but they rarely carry the depth of a real conversation. The more we get used to this kind of relationship, the more disconnected we become from genuine human experience. And the irony is that this excess of information about other people's lives makes us feel even more isolated. By constantly seeing only each person's best moments, we create a silent and unfair comparison. We see achievements, trips, happy moments, and Even though we rationally know that this is only part of the story, we feel left behind. Comparison, once restricted to small social circles, now happens on a global scale. Every day, we're exposed to thousands of lives that are apparently more interesting than our own. The consequence of this is emotional distancing. Instead of strengthening bonds, networks often create invisible barriers. We get used to seeing and being seen, but not really opening up. We lose the habit of active listening, of patience for long conversations, of sincere exchange without filters or edits. And this disconnection doesn't just happen with others, it happens with ourselves. With so much external information filling our minds all the time, there's rarely any space left to look inwards. The result is an emptiness that is difficult to identify. We have the illusion of always being in company, but in moments of silence, we feel an inexplicable discomfort. The time we could use to reflect, to process our emotions, to really get to know ourselves, is constantly filled with notifications and new content. We lose touch with our own inner selves, and this makes us more vulnerable, more anxious, more lost. Digital connection can be an incredible tool, but it can't replace real relationships. And if we're not aware of this, we run the risk of living surrounded by information, but deprived of what really makes us human. If there's one thing that's become rare these days, it's the capacity for mindfulness. We've never been so distracted, and that's no coincidence. Every notification, every new recommended video, every suggested post competes for a single resource: your focus. What used to be a natural process, sitting, reading, reflecting, working with concentration, has now become an almost impossible challenge. How many times have you tried to concentrate on a task, but before you knew it, you were reaching for your cell phone to check something irrelevant? This is because, over the years, we've been trained to divide our attention into 1,000 pieces without ever giving anything full depth. This fragmentation comes at a cost. The brain wasn't designed to switch between stimuli all the time. When we try to focus on something and halfway through, we're interrupted by a message, a notification, or the simple urge to check something on the internet, it takes time to get back up to speed. Studies show that after an interruption, the brain can take up to 25 minutes to return to the same level of concentration as before. Now, think about how many times throughout the day your attention is diverted. If we're constantly switching between tasks, social media, and videos, when do we really devote ourselves to something completely? The problem is that we lose track of what's going on. As we were always consuming new content, we believe that we're productive, that we're learning, that we're moving forward. But in reality, we're just jumping from one stimulus to another without any depth. True concentration requires effort, and everything around us is designed to prevent us from exercising it. The more we get used to quick stimuli, the more impatient we become with long processes. If something doesn't give us an immediate response, we feel bored, restless, tempted to look for something else to fill that momentary void. This creates a dangerous cycle. The less we train our attention, the harder it becomes to stay focused. And the harder it is to focus, the more we rely on distractions to feel stimulated. The impact of this goes far beyond productivity. When we fail to delve deeply into something, we fail to develop real skills, to build lasting knowledge, to have truly original ideas. We become passive consumers, unable to sustain complex thinking for long. But there is good news. Attention can be regained. Just as it was trained to disperse, it can be trained to strengthen again. The first step is to realize what is happening. When you feel the need to pick up your phone for no reason, when you realize that you're jumping from one video to another without absorbing anything, stop for a moment and look at what you're doing. This simple pause is already an act of resistance. The second step is to reintroduce moments of prolonged focus into your day. This means working without interruption, reading without jumping from one subject to another, allowing yourself moments of reflection without external stimuli. At first, it may be uncomfortable. After all, your brain has been conditioned to avoid it, but over time, this ability returns. It's not a question of eliminating content consumption completely, but of regaining control over it. Instead of being pulled along by algorithms and notifications, you decide when and how you consume information. Small changes can make a huge difference. Silencing notifications, establishing periods of the day without screens, practicing activities that require deep concentration are all ways of reversing this process. The more we exercise our attention, the more it strengthens. And by recovering this ability, we rediscover something essential: depth. The world is not going to slow down. The flow of information will not diminish, but we can choose how we interact with it.
And at the end of the day, the most important question is, who is in control of your attention? You or the machines that have been programmed to steal it? Knowing that we are trapped in this vicious cycle of content consumption is a big step. But the real transformation happens when we decide to break out of it. The good news is that this doesn't mean completely abandoning the internet or stopping consuming information.
The problem has never been the technology itself, but the way we interact with it. The challenge, then, is not to eliminate digital content from our lives, but to learn to use it consciously, without being enslaved by it. The first step is to change the way we view information consumption. Today, most people access social networks, videos, and articles without any criteria, just following the flow of what appears on the screen. But if we don't establish a clear purpose for what we consume, we will be guided by the choices of algorithms rather than by our own needs. This means that we need to reverse this logic. Instead of passively consuming content, we should actively choose what we want to learn and when we want to learn it. The best way to do this is to set limits. If you've noticed that you spend more time than you'd like watching videos or browsing social media, a simple and effective strategy is to set specific times for this. Instead of accessing your cell phone at any time, you can set aside periods of the day to consume information intentionally. This prevents consumption from becoming an automatic habit and makes each interaction with the content have a real purpose. Another fundamental change is to transform passive consumption into active learning. Whenever you watch a video or read an article, ask yourself, what have I really learned from this? How can I apply this knowledge to my life? Often, just the act of reflecting on what has been consumed is enough to transform loose information into useful knowledge. If you want to go even deeper, try writing down the main points of what you've learned and looking for ways to put these ideas into practice. Information only becomes valuable when it is used. It's also important to create moments of mental silence. The brain needs breaks to process information, and if we are always consuming new content without interruption, we never give ourselves room for reflection. The absence of stimuli is not a void to be filled. On the contrary, it's in this space that the best ideas, the deepest connections, and the most significant learnings emerge. Slowing down doesn't mean wasting time, but allowing the mind to function in the way it was designed to. And finally, it's worth remembering that the digital world can be a powerful tool, but it should never replace real experience. Reading about a subject is different from practicing it. Watching videos on personal development is no substitute for applying the concepts in everyday life. Having access to information on any subject doesn't mean we know anything about it. True transformation happens when we move out of consumption mode and into action mode. Ultimately, the goal is not to consume more, but to consume better. When we stop being held hostage by algorithms and start consciously choosing what we want to learn, we begin to regain control over our attention, our minds, and above all, our lives. We've reached the central point of all this. At the end of the day, This battle is not just about what we consume, but about who has control of our attention.
If we are not aware of what is happening, we will be guided by impulses, distractions, and algorithms that have no commitment to our growth. But if we take control of this process, we can turn information consumption into something valuable that really contributes to our evolution. Throughout this video, we've seen how we've been fooled by the promise of unlimited knowledge. We've been led to believe that the more we consume, the more we learn, when in fact we've become hostages to an endless stream of distractions. We understand that algorithms are designed to keep us hooked, exploiting our brain chemistry to ensure that we can never stop. We talk about the illusion of learning, how we often confuse the feeling of progress with real growth, and how this false feeling can prevent us from actually applying what we've learned. We also reflected on the invisible cost of this addiction. We lose the ability to focus. We become anxious. We forget what it's like to simply be present without needing a screen to fill every moment of our time. We've seen that even in the age of hyperconnectivity, we've never been so lonely, because we've exchanged real connections for superficial interaction, and the depth of our attention has been fragmented by fast and constant stimuli. But we have also explored the way out of this cycle, to recover our ability to think, learn, and act consciously. And now, it all comes down to a single choice. Continue on autopilot or take control of your attention and what you really want to absorb into your life. If this video made sense to you, if at some point you felt you needed to hear this, now I invite you to be part of this change. First, leave your like and send your donation in the comments with a plus, because this helps the channel reach more people who need to hear this message. And most importantly, share this video with someone who is also trapped in this cycle of consuming content without retention. It could be a friend, a family member, someone you know who is always distracted, always jumping from one video to another without ever really absorbing anything. Freedom begins the moment we realize that we are the ones who have to decide where our attention goes. And when we regain that control, we realize that there is so much more to experience, learn, and live for outside of this endless cycle of consumption.